So we're down to the last two Majestic-class battleships, and today we're going to talk about the second to last one, HMS Prince George. So the Prince George was laid down in Portsmouth Dockyard in September of 1894 and launched less than a year later in August 1895. The first interesting thing to note about the ship actually occurred before she was commissioned. Actually, it occurred with her commissioning. During the process of commissioning the ship, one notable figure was present there. Prince George, the individual that the ship was actually named after, was present at the ship's inauguration, which is kind of interesting. In November 1896, she was welcomed into the Royal Navy, and like many of her sisters, she found her way into the Channel Fleet, where she started her career. And like many of her sisters, she was present at the Diamond Jubilee for Queen Victoria, and a few years later, at the Coronation Fleet Review for Prince Edward as he ascended to the throne. Immediately following the Coronation Fleet Review for Prince Edward, she joined her sister the Magnificent on a tour of the Mediterranean that brought her to Gibraltar. On October 17th, 1903, she was involved in a major collision when her sister, HMS Hannibal, collided with her at about 9 knots in heavy seas, holding her on her starboard side below the waterline. This left the Prince George at serious risk of sinking, taking on water quickly and starting to go down by the stern. Now, the crew luckily were able to brave the high seas and the rushing water and make way for Faro, which the ship ultimately did reach. However, when she arrived at Faro, her stern was very low in the water. In fact, her stern deck was awash, but she was able to receive temporary repairs in Faro and then return to Portsmouth the following year in early 1904 for more permanent repairs. She would actually be in Drydock in Portsmouth, receiving those repairs when that 1905 fleet reorganization occurred. When she returned to the Royal Navy in early 1905, she was assigned to the Atlantic Fleet, as she had originally been assigned to the Channel Fleet, but the Channel Fleet had become the Atlantic Fleet. However, she wasn't done with collisions yet, because in March of that same year, on March 3rd, 1905, she collided with the German armored cruiser, the Frederick Karl, off the coast of Gibraltar. Now, this collision was far less severe than her collision with HMS Hannibal, but still did some minor damage to both vessels. In 1907, she was pulled from the Atlantic Fleet and moved to the Home Fleet, where she would briefly serve as the flagship of the Home Fleet. However, on December 5th, 1907, she would be involved in yet another collision, when she collided with the armored cruiser the Shannon off of Portsmouth. This did much more significant damage than her collision with the German cruiser. This collision ultimately did significant damage to her decking and some of her lifeboat davits, which required some pretty major repairs. These repairs would stretch all the way through 1909, during which time she would get a series of upgrades along with these repairs, including a new wireless telegraph system that was becoming standard across the rest of the Majestic-class fleet. And she would return to the Royal Navy in 1910 and be moved around a little bit, mostly sitting in ports, most notably Devonport, for much of the time up until the First World War. With the outbreak of the First World War, she was briefly appointed the flagship of the 7th Battle Squadron of the 3rd Fleet. However, that role was quickly handed off to the battleship Vengeance. And in mid-August 1914, she was moved into the Channel to protect British expeditionary forces crossing over from the United Kingdom into France to participate on the Western Front of World War I. For most of 1914, she would actually operate in the English Channel, unlike many of her sisters who were shifted around pretty quickly once the war broke out. However, as the Dardanelles campaign kicked off, she was moved down to the Mediterranean to participate in the invasion of the Dardanelles. When she arrived at the Dardanelles, her new base of operations was Tenedos, which was a Turkish island currently being occupied by the British, and she actually put to work doing something that we don't see many Majestic-class battleships doing: actually going to battle. She was involved in the British attempts to break through the Turkish shore defenses around the opening to the Dardanelles, a campaign that she undertook with several other warships. Throughout much of spring 1915, she would be involved in many similar attacks against Turkish shore installations. However, all of that would come to an end in May of 1915 when she ended up taking a 6-inch shell below the waterline. This caused a substantial amount of damage and forced her to be withdrawn from service in that region very briefly. They brought her back to Malta for repairs. However, she'd be back on station in the Dardanelles in mid-July when she assisted French forces in their assaults on Carinthia and Akibaba. By December of 1915, she was involved in the evacuation of Suvla Bay, and then early 1916, she'd be involved in the evacuation of Cape Helles. Following that, she'd be moved briefly to Salonika before being brought back to the United Kingdom. She'd be brought to the Chatham dockyard, where her crew would be removed to staff anti-submarine vessels as the U-boat threat was becoming increasingly prominent in the ongoing conflict. And she'd end up spending most of the rest of the war, at least until 1918, basically just sitting idle, being used as a depot ship and a few other minor purposes around the United Kingdom. One interesting purpose, by the way, was she actually served as a medical vessel for British troops returning from the Western Front who needed medical care when the land-based hospitals were overflowing. In mid-1918, she was refit to be an auxiliary depot ship and briefly renamed the Victorious II, and then tied to her sister ship, the HMS Victorious, for operations near Scapa Flow. However, she would quickly be renamed back to the Prince George. With the end of the conflict, like many other Majestic-class battleships, the Prince George was starting to really show its age, and the decision was made in 1920 to sell her for scrap. She was purchased for scrap the following year in 1921. She was purchased by a German firm in December of 1921, and they began the process of towing her to Germany. However, this would not be completed. On December 30th, 1921, off Cape Verdun in the Netherlands, she broke free of her moorings and ended up wrecking on the shoreline there, where the decision was made to simply strip all her valuables and leave her there to rot where she laid as a breakwater. Now, the ship actually is still there to this day. However, in 2014, what was left of her was buried in sand during a beach expansion project. There are still a few markers present to denote the location of this ship, but other than that, there's not much. And that ends the story of HMS Prince George. If you'd like to learn more about some of her sister ships or what made the Majestic-class battleships so unique, I'll leave a link up here to a playlist I'm building all about the Majestic-class battleships. And remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Barbettes and Binnacles, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.